Good afternoon. This is ISG's The Power of Place, the true cost of inaction. Following on from our first campaign, which recorded shifts in attitudes towards workplace during the turbulence of COVID-19 pandemic, the second iteration of The Power of Place captures sentiment at a time when society is transitioning from short-term decision-making to preparation for a radical new reality. Having conducted one of the largest studies of its type, we've measured the response to this change to not only understand what has worked, but also to highlight the threats and opportunities we face as we look to the future. Retail is well-versed in embracing disruption to find new innovative ways to connect with customers and consumers, whether in-store or virtual marketplace. With challenges around climate change and how we use space intensifying, the next wave is around the corner. One thing is for certain, experience tells us that the future of retail is not purely transactional, but increasingly about the deep emotional connections between brand and customers. Featuring insights from employees, employers, investors, landlords, and developers across the UK, The Power of Place, the true cost of inaction explores the impact on the high street and consumer destinations, and analyses how consumer behaviour continues to drive change and challenge the retail norm. We are hosting a discussion to understand what this means to our customers and consultant partners. Collectively, we are passionate about consumers and the services we provide to them. So welcome, my name is Barry Perkins from ISG. This roundtable event today is providing us a chance to further review the power of place, in particular across retail. Joining me today are some individuals across a very niche sector. I'm joined today by three panellists working within High Street Financial, representing banking and building societies. And we also have someone representing an organisation providing consumer and demographic data. Without further ado, I'm going to pass on first to Chris Reed to start our introductions.
I'm Chris Reed. I'm Head of Construction and Standards for Lloyds Banking Group, and I'm responsible for the operational delivery of our construction investments across our portfolio of buildings. On the High Street, we have three brands: Lloyds Bank, Halifax, and Bank of Scotland.
Thanks, Chris. I'll jump in next. Marie Nisbet. I'm the retail lead for NatWest Property Projects, and I'm responsible for delivering all of the retail transformation projects and programs across the NatWest Group, and that incorporates our Ulster Bank, our NatWest, and our Royal Bank of Scotland brands.
I'll go next. Alex McCulloch, Director at CACI. We, as a business, work primarily with data and using that data to understand people, how they engage with place, and ultimately how you shape spaces and places to reflect the needs of the people. My role is sitting within the real estate industry in that team, and also with an overview on innovation more widely across the business.
Hi everyone, Andrew Tuck, Head of Property Services at Nationwide Building Society, looking after all aspects of property from acquisition through the design, build, maintain and disposal across 600 odd branches, about 10 admin buildings, a couple of data centres. So pleased to be here today.
Thanks to you all for your introductions, and again, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go straight on to our first question. How can bricks and mortar retail businesses rise to the challenge of providing physical spaces that can provide value physical interaction, which the online market cannot cater for?
Shall I start?
Please do,
okay,
Andrew. Yeah.
Barry. So I think for Nationwide, what we've discovered in financial services within our building society is the bricks and mortars is really there for our members, our customers, for moments that matter. The really big life events, you know, the time they need, people need some private time, some one-to-one time with somebody who's going to listen to them and deal with their issues. You know, that could be end of life for someone, you know, some arrangements to be made. It could be a mortgage, or it could be child savings forming, etc. So a lot of stuff these days, especially within financial services, can be done online, but it's really the time that people want that face-to-face connection is really when the big things that are happening in their life, as I said before. So I think that's really where where we nationwide provide that face-to-face experience within the bricks and mortar, within the branches. You know, we've just extended, a new chief exec's come in, just extended our branch promise to make sure that if we're the last branch in town, that we'll stay put at least until 24 now, which is great, which makes sure that we're there. So when we're not doing moments that matter in there, what's the purpose of that bricks and mortar branch? And we're looking at how we utilise that branch to do other things, to keep its presence on the high street, but utilise it when it's not being fully occupied for those moments that matter. So some of that is around obviously the convenience, transactional ATMs, etc. But then what other functions can we do? You know, we're doing lots and lots more telephony type work, digital contact work. Can some of that be ported into the branches? And we're working through some of that, as well as other organisations are. So keeping the presence there on the high street, keeping the brand there, but at the same time making use of those buildings for things rather than just standing empty 3/4 of the time waiting for customers to come in. So that's our approach to it.
From Lloyds Banking Group perspective, I think similar to our peers on the call, we're all seeing in society a huge shift in customer behaviour, and that's really calling into question around what the branch of the future needs to be and what our branches need to be there for. I think it's really clear that having a physical presence is really important. Building on Andrew's point around moments to matter, I think people look to all of our brands here around if there's a challenge, if there's a difficult situation, having the ability to go to your local branch and speak to a professional colleague who will help you in an empathetic way is very, very important. And Lloyds Bank Group recognises that important need of our network. But often what we're finding is our spaces in the high street need to be more than just transactional spaces, and we're looking at how to make these spaces more community-based spaces and link them with our colleagues that work in offices to provide facilities that are local to our colleagues, which will help obviously in our sustainability journey and on our engagement more generally with our local communities. I think the picture of the branch network is an evolving piece and will continue to evolve because of the change in our society, but I'm sure all of our organisations are facing into that positively.
Yeah, I think just jumping into that, I think from a NatWest perspective, the position of bricks and mortar is probably now more under scrutiny than ever before following COVID, and we're trying to work through what does that future estate look like for the NatWest Group. I think from a general retail perspective, it is interesting to see how the use of space is evolving through general retailers. So, for example, how people are consolidating and collaborating. So B&Q are going into Asda. We've got Argos and Sainsbury's. How are they using that space going forward as a collaborative? But then also it's interesting to see people like Amazon, who are generally known as an online, supplier, are touching into certain retail, physical spaces and merging that model. So from a NatWest perspective, that's really interesting to us. And also the evolvement of how space is being used in a kind of social engagement position, and there's lots more of the lifestyle type space being utilised in physical footprint. So people are using the space differently to where they were before. I think from a NatWest perspective, our customers throughout COVID generally came into the branch for a specific reason, and that was the same pre-COVID, post-COVID. It was a purposeful visit. So actually, our kind of branch transactions didn't really change that much. Subject to where people were working, the working patterns didn't really influence how people came into our branch because it was for a specific reason. But I think, observing the changes in the retail estate, I think the trick is understanding the propositions and what propositions you put online versus what propositions you want in that physical space. And going back to what Andrew and Christopher have already said, Chris has already said, it's the moments that matter. It's those key decisions in life where you want that face-to-face, a bit more of an engagement, a conversation, a bit more time. And that's really important to keep that presence going and support for our customers.
And I just think coming at it, I find it really fascinating the way that you guys are all so well aligned on that, because looking at it from a sort of a wider sort of perspective of everyone who's on the high street, I do actually think, in many respects, financial services are ahead of the game in this front. There is very much the case that I think all brands are starting to recognize that the role of the physical store or the physical presence is about that emotional connection. Now, for a fashion brand, that might be about getting someone engaged in the brand, or it might be telling your brand story or whatever, but it's about that emotional connection. And actually the role of online is for that convenience and for, and I use the word in the wider sense, not in your sense, that transactional relationship. I'm going to do the routine, the bit where you don't need any emotion in that engagement. And actually, I think the way you've all spoken there perfectly encapsulates that transition we're seeing, that actually physical space is for that connect, and it's for that one-to-one dynamic you have as a brand or as a business with your customers. And actually you leave the day-to-day stuff online, where it just needs to be fast, quick, convenient, with as minimal friction as possible.
Alex, I think, sorry, Barry, I think the thing that we are finding in banking, financial services, which probably plays out elsewhere, but obviously in COVID, we predicted the sort of footfall that would come back post-COVID, and we haven't got to those numbers. And I think it's pretty much across the piece that, you know, people are just not. We force people to become digitally savvy, and that's driven a lot of that transaction stuff away from branches. What's also happening is so the space in the branches, even though we want to maintain a presence for most, the amount of space you actually need to transact to do those one-to-one matters is actually less and less. So yeah, pre-COVID in the high times, branches were growing, more and more meeting rooms, more and more till points, more and more ATMs, and then we've shrunk down from that to sort of more manageable transactional and meeting model. And I think now there's even more pressure on what do you do with that space, because we're probably all oversized in most of our branches, and that's not that dissimilar, I guess, to retailers, as you explain in Alex, in terms of it's a present. You don't need to go there to browse the catalogue, because you can do that online, but actually you now need to go there to work out how the appliance works, or have the induction for it, etc., etc. So space is different.
And I think you know, being totally frank on that footfall point, I don't think at a high average level that footfall's going to come back. We have seen consumer spend across every product category go through a step change. You know, we accelerated 5 years forwards in terms of digital behaviors in the space of about 2 weeks in April 2020. So we're not going back. I think we then need to accept that if we're not going back, how do we change what we deliver? And I think you're 100% right there, Andrew. It is you still need that physical presence, but you need to recognize that that physical presence now has a different role. And you know, in most scenarios, and again, it will differ by location. There will be certain locations where the transaction remains important. You know, if you're adjacent to a market town or a market or something like that, where you have, you know, lots of cash moving and all the rest of it, you might have different needs in different branches. I think format is key, but there is absolutely the element that most locations in most sectors are probably slightly oversized in their stores, and need to think about how that space better represents the brand, and then need to think about how consumers want to behave in that space. And it could be that actually it's about providing business desks for small business operators, you know, and giving them that, you know, if you do your business banking with you guys, you get an opportunity for desk space 2 days a week. There is that sort of thing.
Really nicely, Alex, on our next question, actually. And I'm really pleased we opened with this question as well. But this one now is really to talk about how has your model flexed and adapted to changing consumer patterns, and what role does your physical presence play in boosting your business model? How are you utilising data, and can you see and react to trends faster? And are you agile enough to change?
Yeah, I think from a NatWest perspective, I think for us, this started in 2020 when we made our commitment around our purpose. And that was really focused around championing potential, helping families and businesses to thrive, and supporting people with how they live their lives. And what we recognised was that consumers' expectations of companies are changing. They're looking for not only financial support, but also how we provide a positive contribution to society, and benefit, you know, customers and communities, and not just shareholders. So our physical presence has to reflect this, and we've taken a lot of thought around how we build that model, and how we provide space for our communities. And I think for us, there's a real desire to be viewed as a, not as a transactional facility, and move towards helping our customers advertise and promote their business. So similar to what you were talking about there, Alex, through providing them space and resources so they can reach a wider audience. So being that host, that community hub, providing that space in our branch network, so it's an alternative use of that space that perhaps 2 years ago was used for something else. I think also it's trying to make it easier for customers to do their jobs by providing them with the space and facilities to work and host meetings, utilising our nationwide network. So an example being our entrepreneurial hub, and getting the entrepreneurs in and hosting that space so they can have those meetings and conversations and learn from us as a bank as well. So much more of a community focus. We've started on that journey. We've got a number of hubs now across our estate, but there's much more to go, I think, in this space. I think we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, I think.
I mean, from a Lloyd's point of view, I think we've been on a journey around moving away from the one size fits all. So every branch in the estate looking identical, serving an identical need. For the last 10 years or so, we've been using data quite actively to do exactly what Alex describes. And our flagship in Manchester was designed around business customers and supporting business customers. And we are flexing our models to reflect the customer demographic in the local community. So our branch network is evolving to be different to different needs in different places, which is absolutely what all organisations need to do.
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially for Nationwide, sort of being a building society and really trying to reflect members' needs. Is the one thing we mustn't forget in all of this is the minorities as such. So vulnerable customers are incredibly important to us, and they're the folk that probably need the most help and time. But obviously, there's not as many of those, so we've got to be very mindful. Building on what Chris and Marie was saying, was not just to play to what the data is saying in terms of numbers. It's what's the data saying in terms of types as well, because you get so many complaints about banks and building societies because they're just treating you as one size fits all. And it's really good, Chris, in terms of reflecting that in terms of the branch network not being. It's the same for everyone. They're very, very different things and different. And generally, in the past, we have always treated them as similar, and now they're actually very different. And we're paying an awful lot of attention to what our vulnerable customers need, and a lot of those do want physical presence. Even though I said that digital has helped out push a lot of people towards it. COVID's pushed a lot of people towards digital. There's an awful lot of people who are not in that space, and they want to come in and they want the reassurance. They're of a certain age normally, and that helps really. And there's sort of that we still have passbooks in Nationwide, and you see someone holding onto their passport because that's really important to them, and that's their savings and that's their livelihood, etc. It's very different to the savvy 20-year-old who's in there with the phone or at home with the phone, etc. So we just need to make sure that we don't just try and do one size fits all in terms of customer profile, etc.
Yeah. So that nuance is essential, Andrew. I think I live in South East London, right? So in between where I am, in equidistance, within walking distance, I've got Peckham on my doorstep, and I've also got East Dulwich. Now, on paper, from sitting in a spreadsheet view, they're effectively similar sized markets in similar parts of South East London, same format. But actually, that Peckham branch is a totally different proposition. When I go into my local branch there, you have lots and lots of people who need to speak to somebody. As you say, they are often vulnerable groups or people who are among the more vulnerable groups in society, either financially or older populations and so on. Whereas if I go to East Dulwich, you've got a huge amount of professional workers. And these two groups live on each other's doorsteps, but the professional workers, they just want to get in and out as fast as possible. And for them, going to the bank is because something's gone wrong and they need to fix their problem. So they're going in a very different mindset and almost irate in their mindset. Now, those two stores would need very different formats, but you're talking less than a mile between them, but they're serving totally different communities. And I do think recognizing who the customer is, you can't adopt a one size fits all, and that applies absolutely in every form of retail. Yeah. So those and post COVID, it becomes even more the case that actually those workers who previously are now who are now going into the East Dulwich branch probably don't know what's hit them, they previously were dealing with all their problems in the city centre because they're in work 5 days a week. But now actually they've got their Friday lunchtime to go and harangue somebody in their local branch.
Some really good points you all raised on that one. I'm going to move on to the next question. I am going to ask you, Alex, to answer first.
Yeah.
In particular around flexible working. I mean, it's here to stay, and it's impacted the volume and consistency of footfall in urban centres. Could amenity-rich spaces that respond to people's innate needs for interaction hold the key to stimulating demand?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of touches on the points we've sort of spoken to on the previous two questions. I think flexible working is here to stay. It's fundamentally here to stay, and our expectation is that in most worker hubs, we're going to see footfall settling down at about 60 to 70% of where it was. And by worker hubs, I'm talking about your Leeds, your Manchesters, your Liverpool city centre locations. And if you think about it, that's because in those locations, a relatively high proportion of the workforce can now work from home 2 to 3 days a week, and they're making use of that, and we're not going back from that. What we are seeing, however, is that when they're in those spaces, their level of engagement has gone up. So they're spending 50, they may only be in the office 3 days a week, but each time they're in, they're spending 15% more on retail and F&B. So effectively, they're netting out at the same sort of spend, but their time in those locations is far more engaged. So they want a place where they'll spend time in, and that might also speak to later opening hours because they stay on after work. It may speak to those being more sort of pleasurable things, but it means that 4 days out of 7, a typical week, you're actually in your home. And so as a result, you expect your home to be different. Like as I just spoke with East Dulwich, you expect to be able to do all the things I used to do in a city, but I now expect it on my doorstep. So you look at, say, Pret, they're opening up in many of these sort of London worker hubs. But I think the other fundamental bit in that is it's very easy for all of us who work in professional jobs and are on this call and probably listening to this call to assume the rest of the world is like us. It's a common sort of fallacy that everyone makes. And the reality of it is that 2/3 of people who work are in jobs where they cannot work from home. And that, yes, includes people who are in service sector jobs, in catering, in retail, includes factory workers, but it also includes doctors, includes nurses, includes teachers, includes a lot of engineers, a lot of people out on site. And all those people are carrying on their lives as they were before, and they need those places to carry on doing the things they were doing before. Now, admittedly, those people are all more online than we were, as we discussed previously, but actually back to that point in the example I used previously between, say, East Dulwich and Peckham, that's replicated across the whole country. You'll be able to find in the suburbs of Leeds that I imagine Roundhay has quite a big daytime population now, but actually Holbeck probably is exactly the same as it's always been, because the nature of the people who are working in those locations is different. And I think it's really important to recognise that we have had that shift in footfall, and that daytime population, which fundamentally is what we're talking about, has reallocated around places. But it's only in certain little hotspots that it's relevant. In many others, we can't just assume, oh, people are working from home now, because actually, in a lot of communities, they're not. They're doing what they've always done. And in those communities, we need to carry on giving them the services they've come to expect. It's not acceptable just to say, oh, the professionals are doing it, therefore we're going to close all these locations. I'm massively generalizing, and I fully hope that all three of you tell me you absolutely aren't doing that, and that's not your strategy.
I think it's interesting from the post-COVID is what the impact has been, because I sort of got on the train yesterday into London, and I always look at the car park at my local station, the commuter station, the tier they built there to meet the needs, which was always overcrowded, to the top tier of those sort of very quick to put up car parks that don't need planning permission in railway stations, effectively is still empty, still not used. That means roughly half of the people or the cars that were parking there were people going in are not going into London, although the trains seem busy. Are they shorter? Are they less frequent? I think that plays into it. The streets in London feel busy. How many people are actually going into the offices, though, is an interesting question. How much more tourism are we attracting? And then when those people are working at home, are they really participating in their community? So are they using the shops, the financial services, the food and beverage places? And I'm not sure, actually, is the question, because
I would say those places aren't set up for what they need them to be. A typical community needs to have everything you would travel no more than 15 minutes for, and too many of our high streets are clone towns which expect people to come in and go shopping, and that's not what you want to do on your lunch break.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Because as well, to get into a lot of towns, you know, from where people live in towns, they normally jump in their car anyway. So you got you got the sustainability issue. You know, so I think our local town planning regeneration actually going to respond to the challenge, and the businesses that are within them, retailers, banking, etc., is really interesting in the future. I think the cost of living crisis is going to play a lot into that. The sustainability crisis we're headlong into is going to play into that. So really, in terms of supporting that sort of change, we've got to start looking at sort of the localism, all of the things. I think town planning, town regeneration has got to be a thing that we all participate in as businesses and individuals, and actually play our roles within the towns rather than being sort of commuters staying at home. We need to be town folk who are using the facilities, and that's where I think some of the stuff Chris and Marie you were talking about was using as business hubs, etc., places for where people can go and work. I think so an integral part of that, and also that space I was talking about. There's going to be, it must be a demand coming for that for residential, etc., etc., and we need to play our role in making sure that we're moving with that rather than just leaving it as fallow space, because it's cheaper and easier to deal with that way. So I think there's an awful lot of challenges on businesses and individuals as we go forward in that space.
I mean, Andrew, you're dead right in many of those areas. How we use our space more productively is going to be the challenge for the future, isn't it? As our operations have naturally shrunk over the last 40 years, we don't need all the processing space that we had. Obviously, our customers are using less cash. There's been a move online, a move to digital payments, which is inevitably changing the shape of our retail portfolio and the needs of our retail portfolio. And what's left behind is exactly what Andrew described, is the need to be absolutely more inclusive in all of its forms with regards to our designs of our branches and the way our branches are perceived, and the ability of our colleagues to service complex needs is going to grow alongside that. So there's quite a few challenges I'm sure we're all facing into as society moves the expectations of the support that our organisations need to give in a different direction, and predicting that is a challenge for us all, isn't it?
Great, thanks for that. That's nicely moves on to our fourth question, actually. So considering the increasingly important role of high street finance within communities, how can investment in physical space at this critical juncture help bolster high streets and regional communities to help them regain or improve on their position post-pandemic? I'll start with you, Marie.
Yeah, I think thanks, Barry. I think it goes back to what we were talking through on the previous questions around that, the purpose of that space. So something we've been exploring is how we bring our bank teams together and have a central hub, so it's easier for our customers to gain access to not only our frontline, banking teams, but our non-personal staff, so our kind of corporate teams as well. So businesses can come in, you can come and do your personal banking. You've got your business banking reps there. And again, we've got a hub for our entrepreneurial accelerator hub. So again, supporting those smaller business areas and giving them access to lots of different audiences, lots of different communities, lots of different stakeholder interests. So I think for me, that's got to be something that we are taking forward and looking at how can we bring all of our teams together. So again, we used to have the separate teams would sit in separate places. Actually, that's not going to work for us going forward. So how do we adopt that one bank approach to support our customers and provide that better offering and those core? So it might be a reduced number, but it's a core, core locations with core services, and that's something that we are exploring. And we've done recently in locations such as Milton Keynes, bringing that all together. So that's one offering that we're trying to provide a better customer proposition for our customers.
I think in terms of it's a really interesting question, because I talked about high street sort of regeneration in that, and there's the issue organisations are facing is we don't, do we really want people travelling for long periods on trains to go into offices? When you use those offices, one from a sustainability point of view, but two also as well with this hybrid working, the timing the effort required to make sure that that's worthwhile experience is becoming really, really hard, and you see situations where people all go to an office and they end up on Teams meetings or whatever, and sitting in separate spaces where they could be doing home. So I think you have to put a lot more effort into that. We're naturally sociable people, maybe some more than others, but we need interaction, and well-being is a really big issue for those who are in remote situations. So do we need to go into our office, into the urban centre to have that interaction? Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. So how do you replicate that locally, which is much more sustainable? Try and do that within individual organisations sometimes works. So where you've got enough people corralled around an area, you can perhaps have an office hub. You can perhaps use the branch, but branch folk are those people who have to go to work to deal with customers and members in our case. So therefore, are normally focused on that rather than communicating with colleagues in other areas. To go into a branch to use, to answer contact calls or video calls or deal with digital issues, again, is quite isolating. So how do you make the community hub? Maybe there's space that we need to start thinking about, which is actually our colleagues work for different organisations, and we come together to interact, to socialise a little bit, share and learn from. But it's not necessarily about our own organisations. Now, financial services organisations are all going security issues, and that that needs to be taken on board. But the fact is, maybe it's completely different going forward. Maybe it's a very different model to what we're used to, and the problem is the only thing we've got to anchor on is the past, isn't it? So we're going to need some really different thinking, I think, in terms of the way we work, and it's leap forward rather than step forward type stuff, because and by leaping forward, that change curve that change pit you go into is really hard to manage through. But so I think government have probably got to start to help in some ways, in terms of some policies, some easing of some of the restrictions, and in terms of planning, in terms of sort of some of the requirements on organisations around the way they behave in their governance, etc. And maybe the technology's got to change a little bit to be more secure when you're mobile. And I think all these things can happen. It's just you can't see them tomorrow. It's quite a long way off, and I think it needs a few people who are thinking differently and trying and experimenting. And it sounds like guys on the call are doing some of that stuff, which is great, and I'm certainly getting some ideas to take forward in my organisation.
I mean, Barry, how long have we got?
You okay?
No, I mean, in terms of to answer this question, because I mean, I think you guys touched on it there, but if you sort of take a wider step back and look at our high streets as they are now, pretty much every institutional sort of framework we have that helps shape those high streets is not fit for purpose anymore, and arguably was probably not fit for purpose pre-pandemic, because the pandemic did change a lot, but mainly it just accelerated things. So this was coming. The pandemic's forced us to front up to it and to deal with it now, rather than just letting it slowly eke out over the coming decade. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you look at leasing. So many of the leases across the UK high street at the moment are grounded in the Landlord Tenancy Act, which was more than 65 years old now, and is based on an assumption that the entire transaction with a customer takes place face to face in a branch, and you value a store on that basis. But that's just not how any form of store physical space is working now. But we still value it on the assumption that it's based on what that transaction was. And as we said, that transaction isn't in the store anymore, it's up in the ether. What's in the store is a relationship, and that needs to be valued in a separate way. So leasing is fundamentally broken, and as is the valuations network, as is planning, as is much of the infrastructure that then supports that whole network in terms of car policy, public transport, cycle lanes, local transport networks. I mean, the whole lot needs change. The good thing we've got is that rather than having to parcel these up all piecemeal and try and deal with each one, you have a degree of will at the moment. You have a degree to which landlords' valuations have fallen, and they're in a position where they can try something new. You have a position where a lot of brands are in a position where they can say, do you know what, we can now reevaluate our entire network, and what's the purpose for it, and what are those roles? And so all of a sudden we're in a position where you have a lot of councils and a lot of planning agencies which are going, the way in which our entire population engage with our spaces has changed. We need to mirror that. So there is an impetus to change, but I do genuinely think we have a window, almost as a society, without getting too grand about it, of about 3 years. And after that, we're just going to revert into a new normal. So these changes do need to happen. And I completely echo Andrew's point that that change needs to come from government to begin with, because I think there is a will, but it needs a collective quarreling and pushing, saying, right, guys, this is the direction of travel. And then people will fall onto it.
Maybe building on Alex and Andrew's point, it's not only government, it's also how we look internally around investment in our places. It's no longer a business case or a benefits case based on turnover or a physical product. There's a lot more softer, less tangible things that we've been trying to drive from our property investments. So how the space feels from a brand perspective, how it feels from a cultural point of view, how it supports our purpose of helping Britain prosper, are things that we haven't spoken about 10 years ago. And we're not looking at branches as a place for customers and offices as a place for workers anymore. The whole thing's coming a lot closer together. We're certainly looking at places in their entirety, and places are no longer there to service a call center or service a transactional customer. They are an embodiment of our values, and these things are less easy to put a business case around, but they're certainly things that we are investing in more than ever before. So that's a natural shift that's accelerating in all of our organisations, I suspect.
Thanks for that.
I think, sorry, Barry, I was just going to add to Chris's point there. I think that's really key as well. And even how you design and lay out your future branches. So technology and property have to work hand in hand here. We have explored putting our automation to the back of the branch, so the transactional side is at the back. So our upfront space at the front of house is lounge areas, conversational space, relaxed spaces for customers to have a conversation. And what's going to unlock that even further is we're all banks, so we have security protocols and technology constraints. But if we can unlock that, so we can have our branch teams can have better conversations, walking around with an iPad and having those conversations and doing transactions. You don't have to be fixed at a desk to do it. You can be sat there having a cup of coffee and doing it, with a customer at your side. Much better experience. So again, that's how I think the future of where our physical footprint and the use of technology can really help us with those better quality customer conversations.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks you all on that one. I'm going to move to our final question. Probably our most important. We've seen the precedents for retail brands place on net zero performance. Do you feel as an industry we're set to deliver on all elements of ESG and our ambitions? What more could be done to ensure our high level commitments have the greatest impact on local occupants?
So Barry, I think you're absolutely right. This is the most important question, and it's the one that we push to the front and then quite quickly push backwards, because there's a number of important immediate things that get in the way. And we had the Glasgow summit, and then suddenly there's enthusiasm, and then suddenly we've got a war, a cost of living crisis, Brexit, etc. And suddenly we find it's gone to the back and needs to come back to the front again. I personally think within financial services operations, most of the organisations are absolutely pushing ahead. We have all of our electricity is green. We invested in wind, solar. We invest in green energy from wind, and so it's quite a big bit of our operational estate. You can quite easily move towards zero carbon. The trouble in this country, we have a whole load of gas, and gas heats buildings generally because of the climate, and actually moving away from that is expensive, especially in big buildings. So that is something that we can tackle from a technology point of view. I think the more important thing, and this is where we struggle most, is people have got to change mindset. You call it hearts and minds or whatever, but we go into an office and we expect it to be shirt sleeves weather all year long, and in reality, in times gone by, you wore a thick suit in the winter and a thin suit if you're a man, or probably a lady as well. But you wore thick clothing in the winter and thin clothing in the summer. And you expected that difference. You put a jumper on when it gets cold at home. So I think maybe the cost of living crisis will drive some of that out from a financial point of view, which will then drive some of the benefits in terms of fuel, etc. But operations is a really, really small part of it. Even the third party side of it is relatively small compared to the products, and retail. So I think manufacturing was starting to address some of that, was physical, but retail. What about the retail products that are produced? Some areas are really good, and others paying lip service to it. But then you get into financial services, and financial services products are effectively loans to buy things, to businesses and to individuals. Nationwide loan on 25% of the UK's housing, and what's the situation, and it's still not defined, but effectively if you loan money on things, you have a responsibility there. We're doing a lot around EPC and raising that up, but you look at your own house, you look at housing in general, the insulation in our housing to save those emissions from heating are they're totally inadequate. And we're still, I even heard yesterday, it's hard to believe that new houses are allowed to be designed and receive planning permission and receive building regs permission, and are below the standard that we require for the future, just because it's an economic situation. That seems crazy, doesn't it? We have an aim, but our policy says you don't need to actually build to that standard. So there's a whole load of things we need to address. Commuting comes in that as well, and we've talked about all that through this whole thing around the homework, and then there's a whole load of stuff to play in there in this way as we go forward, rather than, like I said, if we go back to where we were, we'll just end up with the same old situation, which ends up putting the same pressure onto our sustainability requirements going forward. So the biggest question and the hardest one to answer.
One thing I would just say is there is a will, right, in terms of the consumer. People do respond very well to it, and there's a temptation, if you went back a few years, to assume that it's mainly young people who care about it. Absolutely, young people do care about it, but we consistently see when we look at surveys that people will judge a brand and judge a service on the basis of its ESG credentials at every age and every income. So there is a real shift, and this again is an acceleration, to reiterate that point, of people caring more about communities and caring more about the spaces they live in. And I do think we put an awful lot, rightly, on the E of ESG. I think increasingly what we're going to see is the S, the society part, becomes ever more important as well, particularly as we move into this cost of living squeeze that we're looking at in the coming sort of 18 months to 2 years. I think we're really going to start thinking about actually how do we as brands and how do we as organizations impact on society, and how can we better support society. So I think there is a will from the consumer to see brands engaging on this, and I think again there is a collective desire from all parties in this sort of exchange to do the right thing almost, which is encouraging, but there's a lot to still be done.
Yeah, Alex, I think you hit the main point there, isn't there? All of our organisations are placed to face into the biggest challenges that society offers. The cost of living squeeze that's affecting families up and down the United Kingdom is absolutely what all of our organisations are focused on, supporting our customers through what is going to be a very difficult journey, and addressing some of the ESG ambitions is going to be a collective responsibility of us all. And you're right, there's no easy answers to any of this, and it's going to take landlords, tenants, government, all organisations to have a collective aim towards it. And building on Andrew's point around building buildings that are not compliant, the same is true where landlords are where you have a heavily landlord reliant estate. It can't fall upon the tenants to make all of the investments required to make that estate compliant. There has to be a collective responsibility on moving forward towards those ESG targets from a property point of view, and enabling our properties to support the customer base as the society changes.
I think NatWest are doing a lot in this space as well. So obviously there's things we can be doing to support our customers, helping them understand their carbon footprint, and a lot of commitments made around investing in climate sustainable funding and businesses that support that. So there's a lot happening in that space. But you're right, we need to get our own house in order as well. And I think from a property position, we own an aged estate, lots of varied and aged buildings, lots of fantastic buildings, but from a climate perspective and energy perspective, there's a lot of work to do. And I think what we're trying to do is wrestle through how do we identify what the right thing should be. I think the government legislation is still not that clear, and the emerging picture of the future is not that clear either. So what target do we need to hit is still, I think, a moving target. But what is good to see is that EPC and the climate investment we need to put into our buildings, both from a services perspective, so our mechanical and electrical footprint, but also the fabric of the building, that jumps up on the agenda. So those elements are now being reviewed as part of business cases, so we can make informed decisions, whereas previously they probably weren't as high on the agenda. So I think that's been a real shift change for us over the last couple of years.
So that's great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and responses to our questions. I'm going to close the session here. Firstly, my thanks go to my silent colleagues in the room that have been a big enabler for this session today. Obviously, I'd like to thank our panelists, Andrew, Marie, Chris, and Alex, for supporting this debate and obviously taking the time from their very busy diaries today. I hope you found the session worthwhile. When you consider the presence of the three organisations have in the High Street, your thoughts and overview has been very, very valuable. Thank you. To those who download and watch this session, I hope you find it valuable too. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.